Cardiologists warn that the first few minutes after you wake up may be one of the more physiologically stressful windows of your entire day for your heart, and most people have never been told why. This isn't a rare condition or a genetic fluke. It's a well-documented pattern in cardiology called the morning surge, and several ordinary habits done in that window can make it considerably more dangerous than it needs to be. Today we're going through 5 ordinary morning habits that research has connected to this risk window, particularly for people over 60. Not to frighten you, but so you know exactly what's worth adjusting and why. Before we start, none of this is a reason to panic about your morning routine. It's a reason to make a few small, well-supported adjustments, the kind that take minutes, not lifestyle overhauls. Let's start with what's actually happening inside your body in the minutes after you open your eyes. Because once you understand this, the rest of the video will make a lot more sense. It is worth saying at the outset that most mornings, for most people, pass without any incident at all. This video is about tilting the odds a little further in your favor, particularly if you are over 60 or have any known cardiovascular risk factors. Not about treating an ordinary morning as an emergency waiting to happen. Waking up is not a gentle transition. Your circadian rhythm triggers a real, well-studied release of cortisol shortly after waking. Researchers call this the cortisol awakening response, and it produces a measurable rise in heart rate and blood vessel tone in a short window. At the same time, your nervous system shifts from its resting, parasympathetic state toward a more activated, sympathetic one. Blood pressure typically rises in this window. This is sometimes called the morning blood pressure surge, and it's genuinely one of the more consistent findings in cardiovascular chronobiology. On top of that, after 7 to 8 hours without drinking anything, most people wake up mildly dehydrated, which affects blood viscosity somewhat. A real, if modest, contributing factor alongside the hormonal shifts already underway. None of these things are dangerous on their own. They happen to everyone, every day. The concern researchers point to is what happens when certain behaviors are layered directly on top of this natural physiological shift, especially in a heart that's already been working for 6, 7, or 8 decades. This is also part of why cardiology research has consistently found that heart attacks and strokes cluster somewhat more in the morning hours than at other times of day, a pattern referred to in the literature as the morning surge in cardiovascular events. The exact size of that increase varies across studies, but the general pattern is well replicated. It is worth understanding why this particular window gets so much attention from researchers specifically. Unlike most points in the day, waking up involves several physiological systems shifting at once in a fairly compressed period of time, rather than gradually across hours. None of these individual shifts are unusual or concerning on their own. Cortisol rising in the morning is a completely normal, healthy part of your circadian rhythm. It is one of the reasons you feel alert rather than groggy. The concern researchers focus on is specifically the combination of several shifts happening simultaneously, layered with additional behavioral stress on top. Age plays a role here too, largely because blood vessels naturally become somewhat less elastic over the decades, and the body's compensatory systems, like the baroreceptors we will discuss shortly, respond a little more slowly than they did at 30 or 40. None of this is something to be alarmed by. It is simply part of why small adjustments matter more as we age. There is also a seasonal pattern worth knowing about. Research has found that morning cardiovascular events cluster somewhat more heavily in colder months specifically, when the combination of cold ambient temperature and the morning surge appears to compound. This is one more reason the habits in this video are worth taking a little more seriously in winter than in the height of summer. One more piece of context worth knowing. For people who take blood pressure medication, there is an active area of research called chronotherapy, looking at whether taking certain medications in the evening rather than the morning better matches the body's natural rhythm and may offer some added protection during this exact morning window. This is a genuinely interesting, evolving area of cardiology research, and if you take blood pressure medication, it is worth asking your own doctor whether timing adjustments make sense for you specifically. The first habit worth knowing about: jumping out of bed the instant an alarm goes off. It feels efficient. For a lot of people, over 60 specifically, it can trigger something called orthostatic hypotension, a sudden drop in blood pressure tied to standing up too quickly. Here's the mechanism. While lying down, blood is distributed fairly evenly through the body. Standing up abruptly shifts a meaningful volume of blood down into the legs due to gravity, and the heart suddenly has less blood available to send to the brain in that instant. In younger people, pressure sensors called baroreceptors detect this instantly, and the heart rate adjusts to compensate, often before it's even noticeable. With age, these sensors respond somewhat more slowly, and that lag is what produces the dizziness, blurred vision, or brief lightheadedness some people feel on standing. This matters beyond the discomfort itself. Falls are a leading cause of injury in older adults, and a meaningful portion happen in exactly this window, the first minute or two after getting out of bed. The fix here is genuinely simple and well supported. When you wake, stay lying down for 30 to 60 seconds and breathe slowly. Then sit on the edge of the bed for another minute before standing, gently circling your ankles to help blood return toward the heart. Only then stand slowly. It is worth adding that orthostatic hypotension is common enough that it is specifically screened for in many geriatric checkups, using a simple blood pressure test taken lying down and then again after standing. If you have ever felt dizzy standing up quickly, this is very likely the mechanism involved, and it is worth mentioning to your doctor at your next visit. This effect tends to be more pronounced first thing in the morning specifically, compared to standing up quickly later in the day, simply because the body has had all night to settle into its lying down equilibrium, making the shift more pronounced than a quick stand from a chair during the day. It is also worth mentioning that certain medications, including some blood pressure treatments and drugs for Parkinson's disease, can make orthostatic hypotension more pronounced. If you notice dizziness on standing regularly, mentioning your current medication list to your doctor alongside this symptom can help identify whether an adjustment might help. A related warning sign worth knowing: if dizziness on standing happens most mornings, rather than only occasionally, or if it is ever accompanied by chest discomfort, that combination is worth a prompt conversation with a doctor rather than waiting for a routine checkup. The second habit: skipping water first thing and going straight for coffee, the phone, or the bathroom. It's an easy thing to overlook, since dehydration after sleep doesn't usually feel dramatic. Overnight fluid loss through breathing and normal perspiration leaves blood somewhat more concentrated by morning, sometimes described as increased blood viscosity. This is a real, if generally modest, physiological pattern that adds a small additional load on the cardiovascular system during a window that's already under some hormonal stress. This is part of why research has found cardiovascular events cluster somewhat more in the morning hours specifically. Dehydration is thought to be one modest contributing factor among several, not a standalone explanation on its own. The practical fix is almost too simple to need explaining. A glass of room temperature water, roughly 300 to 400 milliliters, before coffee, before your phone, before anything else. It's a low-effort habit with a genuinely reasonable amount of physiological logic behind it. It is worth knowing that thirst itself becomes a somewhat less reliable signal with age, meaning that by the time you consciously feel thirsty in the morning, mild dehydration may already be further along than it would have been at a younger age. This is part of why treating morning hydration as a scheduled habit, rather than waiting to feel thirsty, tends to work better for older adults specifically. A simple way to build this habit without relying on memory alone: leave the glass of water somewhere you cannot avoid seeing it, directly in front of where your alarm sits or propped against your phone charger. So reaching for your phone means reaching past the water first. It is also worth noting that coffee and tea themselves do contribute some fluid to your total intake, contrary to an older, now largely revised belief that caffeinated drinks are strongly dehydrating. The concern here is really about sequencing, plain water before caffeinated beverages, rather than caffeine being harmful to hydration status itself. The third habit is where I want to be especially careful, because this is an area where online health content, including some very popular videos, has significantly overstated the actual research. Drinking coffee, especially strong or concentrated coffee, on a completely empty stomach. Let's be precise about what the evidence actually shows. For most healthy adults, moderate coffee consumption is generally considered neutral to mildly protective for cardiovascular health across large population studies. This is well established and worth saying clearly, since coffee gets an unfairly dramatic reputation in some corners of the internet. Caffeine is a real stimulant. It does raise heart rate and blood pressure modestly, and absorption happens somewhat faster on an empty stomach than with food in the system. For the large majority of people, this is a mild, temporary, unremarkable effect, not a dangerous one. Where this becomes worth genuine attention is specifically for people with existing, often undiagnosed, coronary artery disease, or a known sensitivity to caffeine-related palpitations. For that smaller group, stacking a caffeine spike directly onto the morning hormonal surge on an empty stomach is one more input worth being mindful of. Not because coffee itself is dangerous, but because timing and context can matter more as cardiovascular risk factors accumulate with age. The practical, non-alarming version of this advice. If you enjoy coffee, there's no strong reason to stop. Having a small amount of food first and drinking water before your first cup are simple, low-cost adjustments. Not because coffee is a cardiovascular bomb, but because they're easy, sensible habits with no real downside. It is also worth mentioning decaf as a genuinely reasonable option for anyone who loves the ritual of morning coffee, but wants to reduce the caffeine-related stimulation specifically without giving up the habit entirely. This is a simple substitution that removes most of the physiological question altogether. For context on scale, it is worth remembering that large population studies on coffee and cardiovascular health generally involve people drinking coffee in all sorts of patterns, including on empty stomachs, and the overall associations found in that research still tend toward neutral or mildly favorable. This is meant to be reassuring, not something to overthink. It is worth adding that herbal tea or warm water with lemon are reasonable alternatives for anyone who finds that coffee specifically triggers noticeable palpitations, without needing to give up a warm morning beverage ritual altogether. It is worth being honest that individual sensitivity to caffeine varies quite a lot from person to person, which is part of why the same cup of coffee that feels perfectly fine for one person might produce noticeable palpitations in another. Paying attention to your own body's response over time is more useful here than any single general rule. Quick note if this is useful so far. Subscribing helps this channel keep making videos like it, and I read every comment. The fourth habit, jumping straight into intense exercise, a hard run, heavy lifting, a high-intensity class, within minutes of waking up. To be clear from the outset, exercise is one of the most well-established tools for long-term cardiovascular health at any age. Nothing here is an argument against morning exercise in general. The more specific point researchers raise is about intensity and timing together, particularly for older adults who may have undiagnosed coronary artery disease, which is common enough in this age group to be a real consideration. Adding a sudden, intense demand for oxygen directly on top of the morning hormonal surge, without any warm-up or transition period, is where caution is generally advised. This becomes a more meaningful factor when combined with the earlier habits on this list. Exercising while dehydrated and fasted removes some of the buffer that food and water normally provide, and combines several modest risk factors rather than just one. The practical approach many cardiologists suggest. If you exercise in the morning, allow your body some transition time first. Hydrate, eat something light, and warm up gradually, rather than starting at full intensity immediately. For higher-risk individuals specifically, shifting the most intense session to midday or evening is sometimes suggested. though this is very much an individual conversation with your own doctor, not a blanket rule. It is worth being specific about what a reasonable warm-up actually looks like. A few minutes of easy walking or light movement before ramping up to a harder effort, rather than starting a hard run or heavy lift from a completely cold start. This single adjustment addresses most of the concern researchers raise here. It is also worth noting that this concern applies specifically to sudden maximal effort exercise first thing in the morning. A gentle morning walk or light yoga session does not carry the same considerations at all and remains a genuinely excellent way to start the day for almost everyone. For anyone specifically managing known heart disease, cardiac rehabilitation programs typically build in exactly this kind of gradual warm-up as standard practice, which is a useful model even for people without a diagnosis. If it is standard practice for higher-risk patients, it is a reasonable habit for anyone to adopt. It is worth adding that the research concern here scales with exercise intensity specifically, not with movement in general. A light morning walk, gentle stretching, or an easy bike ride carry essentially none of this consideration, since the sudden maximal oxygen demand that raises concern simply is not present at that intensity level. The fifth habit is one that's become genuinely popular through wellness and biohacking content. Intense cold exposure, especially a fully cold shower, immediately after waking. There is real physiology behind why this deserves a careful, non-dramatic conversation. Sudden cold water exposure on the torso triggers a genuine, well-documented cardiovascular response, a rapid narrowing of blood vessels near the skin's surface, which can produce a real, measurable spike in blood pressure within seconds. For most healthy adults without underlying cardiovascular disease, this response, while real, is generally well tolerated, which is part of why cold exposure practices have grown so popular without widespread reports of harm in healthy populations. The genuine area of caution that cardiology research points to is specifically for people with existing heart disease, significant risk factors, or those layering cold shock directly onto the already elevated morning surge without any gradual adaptation. For that group specifically, a sudden extreme cold stimulus is a real and reasonable thing to be cautious about. This is closer to how open water swimming safety guidance is written for exactly this reason. The sensible, non-alarmist approach. If you're over 60, have any known cardiovascular risk factors, or simply aren't sure, it's genuinely worth easing into cold exposure gradually, rather than starting with full intensity, beginning with lukewarm water and reducing the temperature slowly over weeks, directing cold water toward the arms and legs before the chest, and stopping immediately if you notice palpitations, dizziness, or chest discomfort of any kind. None of this means cold exposure is inherently dangerous for everyone. For many healthy people, it's a well-tolerated practice with some genuinely supported benefits. It means the popular one-size-fits-all version of this advice online doesn't account for individual cardiovascular risk the way it should, and a gradual approach costs nothing while meaningfully reducing any real risk that does exist. It is also worth distinguishing between a brief cool-to-cold shower and full cold water immersion, like an ice bath or open water swim. The physiological shock tends to scale with both the temperature and how much of the body is submerged at once, which is part of why full immersion practices carry somewhat more of this specific consideration than a shower does. If you already practice cold exposure regularly and tolerate it well, this is not a signal to necessarily stop. The research concern here is much more about sudden, unprepared first exposure, or scaling up too quickly, than about a well-established, gradually built practice in someone without cardiovascular risk factors. It is also worth knowing that some of the genuinely supported benefits associated with cold exposure research, like improved mood and alertness, appear to occur even with relatively brief, moderate cold exposure, meaning a gradual, moderate approach does not necessarily mean giving up the benefits people are often seeking in the first place. It is also worth mentioning that breathing technique during cold exposure appears to matter in the available research. Slow, controlled breathing rather than the natural gasping response some people have. To sudden cold seems to reduce the intensity of the cardiovascular spike, which is part of why practices that pair cold exposure with breathing training emphasize this specifically. Bringing this together, here's a simple morning sequence some cardiologists suggest, particularly for people over 60 or anyone with cardiovascular risk factors. None of it requires more than about 5 extra minutes. Minute 1. When you wake, stay lying down and breathe slowly and deliberately for a few breaths. In for around 4 seconds, a brief hold, and a slightly longer exhale. This gives your nervous system a gentle, gradual signal rather than an abrupt jolt. Minute 2. Sit up slowly on the edge of the bed and drink the glass of water you left within reach the night before. This is the moment to fully rehydrate before anything else. Minute 3. Stay seated on the edge of the bed a little longer, gently circling your ankles in both directions. This activates the muscle pumps in your calves that help blood return toward your heart before you stand. Minute 4. Still seated, do a few gentle stretches, shoulders, neck, arms overhead, to ease your muscles into activity gradually rather than abruptly. Minute 5. Stand up slowly. Pause for a moment to make sure you feel steady, and then move into the rest of your morning at an unhurried pace, saving anything more intense. Coffee on a full stomach, exercise, cold exposure, for a little further into your morning. None of these 5 minutes require any special equipment or preparation beyond a glass of water left within reach the night before, which is itself worth building into your evening routine specifically, so it is not one more thing to remember while still half asleep. It is worth trying this sequence for a week or two before judging whether it is making a difference. Like most habits, the value tends to become more apparent with consistency than from a single morning. If you share a home with a partner or family member, this 5-minute sequence is also worth mentioning to them specifically, particularly if they are the one more likely to notice a fall or a moment of dizziness before you do. For anyone who shares this 5-minute routine with an older parent or relative specifically, it is worth framing it gently as an easy addition rather than a correction. Most people respond better to a small, optional suggestion than to being told their long-standing morning habit has been wrong. None of the 5 habits we've discussed today are inherently dangerous for everyone. The consistent thread across all of them is the same. Your cardiovascular system responds better to gradual transitions than abrupt ones, particularly in that first hour after waking, and particularly as cardiovascular risk factors naturally accumulate with age. If you have diagnosed heart disease, high or low blood pressure, diabetes, a history of arrhythmia, or take cardiovascular medications like beta blockers or blood thinners, these are exactly the kind of morning routine changes worth discussing with your own doctor first, since individual medical history changes what's appropriate. It is worth remembering, too, that consistency matters more than perfection here. Missing this routine on an unusually rushed morning occasionally is not something to worry over. The value comes from it being your general pattern, not from never deviating from it even once. It is also worth remembering that this entire video describes patterns studied at a population level. Any individual person may tolerate any of these 5 habits perfectly well their entire life without incident. The goal here is shifting the odds sensibly, not predicting any single person's outcome. One honest note before we close. I'm David Morgan, an AI-generated health educator, not a licensed cardiologist or physician. Everything in this video is general, source-checked information based on published cardiology and chronobiology research, not personal medical advice. If you have existing heart or blood pressure concerns, please talk to your own doctor before changing your morning routine, exercise timing, or exposure to cold. If this was useful, let me know in the comments which part of the morning routine you're going to try first, and I'd genuinely like to hear it. I read every comment. Next time, we'll look at something connected to this. What actually happens to your blood pressure while you sleep, and why some people's numbers look fine at the doctor's office, but tell a very different story overnight. I'll see you there.